Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Lori Salganikoff, Executive Director of the Chestnut Hill Conservancy, an educational center and advocate for the architecture, open spaces, and history of Chestnut Hill and surrounding communities in the Wissahickon watershed. Tonight, we're proud to present a virtual lecture by my good friend, Dr. Kathleen Abplanalp, detailing the captivating story behind Erdenheim Farm and highlighting the profound dedication of the McCausland family to its vibrant and deeply authentic preservation. But for the McCausland family, this lecture could have been an historical recollection of a farm that had been in continuous use since the arrival of William Penn. Thankfully, instead of the 400-home development that could have replaced it, the farm remains at over 475 acres, including the acres owned by White Marsh Foundation. Virtually all of Erdenheim Farm is protected by conservation easements from all but the most limited development, and the farm's 44 historic buildings have been restored with great care. In recognition of their remarkable efforts, the Conservancy honored the McCausland family, Bonnie and Peter, Chris and Elizabeth, with the Shirley Hansen Founders Award in 2022. The McCauslands have helped to inspire a community of conservation that the Conservancy and many of you are also a part of. And we're delighted to learn more about the farm's history this evening. We're honored that the family joins us this evening, along with Peter Ernst, and that farm manager Dan Laurie will be available to answer questions during the Q&A with Kathleen. Slide. Proud to thank lead sponsor Chubb, general sponsors Bowman Properties, Dennis F. Meyer Inc., the Nottingham Walsh Goodman Group of Merrill Lynch, Friends of the Wissahickon, MIS Capital, and the George Woodward Company for their support of the Conservancy through 2024. Slide. Tonight's Discovering Chestnut Hill lecture and much of our work this year is made possible by the presenting sponsor for this lecture series, John B. Ward and Company Arborists, along with the lecture series supporting sponsor, Cawley Masonry. I'm glad to see so many of you who are members and supporters of the Conservancy's work. Members enjoy discounted tickets to events such as tonight's lecture. So if you're not a member and wish to find out more, the link to join us is in the chat. Tonight only, if you join, we will honor the member discount for this evening's lecture and send you a refund for the difference. A final thanks to our program committee for organizing tonight's lecture, led by program committee co-chairs Jean McCoubry and Susan Peck, and the Conservancy's programs and communications manager, Chrissy Clausen. Stay tuned as we will soon unveil our fall tour and lecture series lineup, featuring highlights like the Aubrey Arboretum with George McNeely, the return of Night of Lights in October, and the Preservation Awards in December. And of course, we hope to see you all at our June 8th fundraiser honoring the wonderful Charlie Dilks. Tickets are still available, but they're almost gone. Please make sure that you've muted yourself. We invite you to add any questions you have during the program in the chat for the Q&A following the lecture that I will moderate. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Ken Leroy of the Conservancy's event sponsor, John B. Ward, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Ken?
Thank you, Lori. I'm Ken Leroy. I've been an International Society of Arboriculture certified arborist since 1991. I've been working with John B. Ward since for 12 years now. How time flies. We're a professional tree company, arboricultural company focused on tree preservation, conservation, pruning, cabling, lightning protection, treatments for disease and insects. And proud to say that we take care of that champion elm at Erdenheim Farm by the Manor House. So, and that thing is inspected, injected, lightning protected, and cabled. So hopefully our efforts will continue. It's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kathleen Abplanalp. Dr. Abplanalp is a historian and researcher, analyzing and documenting historic properties, not only properties, but schools, factories, churches, dams, bridges, railroads, and not least, historic farmsteads. Dr. Abplanalp has been involved with Erdenheim with the committee to do the National Register for Erdenheim Farms, the Historic Register. So it's my, also, Kathleen is an independent historic preservation consultant. She's been involved with the Leroy Conservancy and presently as an adjunct professor at Jefferson College of Architecture and Built Environment. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kathleen Abplanalp.
Thanks so much, Ken. Can everybody hear me and see me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that introduction, Ken. I'm really delighted to be here. My introduction to Erdenheim Farm came through Lori Selganikoff, the executive director of the Chestnut Hill Conservancy. She introduced me to the McCausland family, Peter Ernst, Dan Laurie, who were interested in having a National Register nomination written on this extraordinary property. And so we're making our way through that. Hopefully that will be completed very soon. There's no doubt that this incredible property will be named to the National Register and designated, so forth. So thank you. That's where the research for this lecture comes from. So the image that you're seeing on the screen right now is something that you may be familiar with if you've ever been to the farmstead off of Flowertown Road. This image comes from a 1923 issue of Country Life magazine, shortly after this complex of buildings was constructed by George Widener. So this is the Erdenheim Farm that I'm assuming most members of the audience are familiar with. But there is so much more to Erdenheim Farm, as I've learned through my research. And I'm happy to share that history of the entire property with you tonight. So this is a present-day aerial image of the more than 470 acres that make up the historic Erdenheim Farm. Now, this property is not owned by a single owner. It is not a single property. In fact, it's multiple separate parcels. This border or this boundary reflects the historic boundaries of the farm as it existed under the owners who cobbled together many, many parcels starting in the 1860s. That is when these parcels, which were agricultural in use, were consolidated to create the horse breeding and training operation, as well as the country estate that we now know as Erdenheim Farm. So let's take a look at what the area looked like before this period, before the parcels were consolidated to create the present day farm. So what you see here is a 1855 map with the area that is now Erdenheim Farm property sort of highlighted in blue. And what you can see here is no Erdenheim Farm. These were in fact separate agricultural parcels that were owned by various different farmers in the area. You can see that the Wissahickon Creek kind of cuts through the right side of it, and there are a number of historic roads there running through it as well. Now, before Erdenheim became Erdenheim, as I said, this was a very agricultural area. And so somebody coming into the area in the 1860s, this is 1863, right before these parcels started to become consolidated, would have seen these small farmsteads. So up on the right, and these are all contained within the Erdenheim Farm district today. So these are fairly simple farmhouse up at the top, along Stenton Avenue. Another one on the left side, also along Stenton Avenue, but closer to, a little bit closer to the creek. And then moving along, another farmhouse that is on the west side of the Wissahickon Creek. Here is the main farmhouse off of Flowertown Road, which now contains the farmstead complex that has the farm stand and the livestock. And then a number of other farmstead properties that were located off of Flowertown Road, up from the larger farmstead. So it's not until the early 1860s that the property starts to look like and function in its present day operation as a thoroughbred training facility and as a country estate. And this happens under a property owner called Aristides Welch. And you can see at the center of the screen right here, where I've got my arrow, the property that he buys. At the time, he calls it Leamington Stud Farm. So there's not much on the property at this time, but he does immediately set to work building this half-mile track for his thoroughbred racehorses. Now, information about him is a little bit hard to come by. He's an elusive figure, but while he owned the property, he did improve it with resources in addition to the half-acre racetrack, a stallion barn, which is it's a stone barn that is still on the property to this day and is probably the oldest surviving resource associated with the historic Erdenheim Farm operation. And for his horses, and including his prize horse Leamington, he built this private stable. He also created a graveyard for his horses, and he had many in addition to Leamington that he kept here on the farm, bred and trained. And this is a contemporary an image of visitors visiting Leamington's grave. This is a present day photo of the horse graveyard containing not just Leamington's grave, but a number of other well-known and prize-winning thoroughbreds that were bred or raised or trained at Erdenheim Farm throughout the years. Now, during his occupation of this part of Erdenheim, he's living in this farmhouse that he has sort of modified or transformed into something grander than it was when it was first built. This is a building that preceded Welch's occupation of the property, a farmhouse that was probably dated to the earlier 19th century. But it is described as the original Erdenheim. And at the time, a writer had said about the property, this is in 1873, about a decade after Welch purchased it. The writer said that this was an old, roomy family mansion on a level plateau, surrounded by oaks and many varieties of cedar. And then 10 years later, in 1883, shortly before Welch sold the property again, another writer described it, just giving you an idea of how many people were actually making Erdenheim Farm at that time a touristed place. It was an attraction to people who were coming from really all over the country. Its proximity to Chestnut Hill made it really an accessible place. And obviously, because of the fame of the farm even then as a place where prize-winning thoroughbreds were trained and bred and and so forth. It was, it had become a very big tourist destination. So this writer says that from the gate of the home grounds, there is an uninterrupted view of a broad, tree-dotted, slightly rolling plain spreading out on three sides of the observer and rising to a steep acclivity to the perfect forest of trees crowning the hill. It's a gentleman's country estate, and country estates are in view all around. This also gives you an idea of how popular the Chestnut Hill area had become at that point in time for people in the Philadelphia area to erect, design country estates. So the yard, again, this quote continues, is almost a park. So many trees shut in the house from the roadway. A plain, old-fashioned double house. So you can see the front of the house and then the rear wing. With a pillared Greek portico, so common 50 years ago. Aside from its facade, the house makes no pretensions, but it has a delightfully substantial, comfortable look. Well, the house did not maintain, Welch did not maintain the ownership of the property for too long. By 1882, he sells the estate to a Minnesota native and veteran horse trainer called Norman Kitson. And this 1889 map shows Kitson as the property owner. It shows the half-mile track right below the name Norman, but it also shows a new 1-mile track. During his ownership of the property, Kitson also extended his ownership through the acquisition of land on the opposite side of the Wissahickon Creek. This is a present-day aerial photograph of the tracks, still in the same place as it was when it was originally constructed by Kitson, and very obviously standout feature on this property, even if it's not used in its original capacity as a racetrack. It absolutely survives as a contributing feature to this property. He also added a private stable. This was for his horses that he brought to the farm and began breeding and training there. And I should also note about the 1-mile track. At the time, it was said to be the widest private track in the country. So in addition to this stable and the stable across the street, Erdenheim Farm gained a combined indoor track with and stable with 45 stalls and accommodations for grooms, a blacksmith shop, and a windmill-powered well. And this is all under Kitson's ownership. And in addition to that, Kitson erected a stone bridge to cross the Wissahickon Bridge in the area behind the original Erdenheim. Well, Erdenheim Farm changes hands once again in the late 1800s when Kitson's heirs sell a big chunk of the property to a wealthy Philadelphia banker and railway magnate called Robert Carson. So this is a 1909 map showing the property under Carson's ownership. It changes quite a bit from when Kitson owns it. Carson develops the property with multiple new resources, buildings, landscape features that we'll see in just a second. So what does he do here under his ownership? Well, he modernizes an old farmhouse that is actually it's the current day mansion on the Erdenheim property. What you can see here is that he takes an old farmhouse that's sited on the hill, and he adds an addition that has a crenellated top. He adds a full width porch to the house to really give it an updated look. And he's really moving in the direction of creating a very dignified and notable country estate in this area. What else did he do? He did things that a lot of wealthy landowners were doing at the time. People who owned country estates were creating follies on their estates, accessorizing them with things like lakes. So this was an artificial lake that was fed by a little tributary of the Wissahickon. And in this lake, he created little islands. And there were 2 islands, one of which was accessed by this ornamental bridge. And this is the big barn in the back, which is no longer there. This was a view of his house from below the hill. You can see that there is a retaining wall. So it's really sort of the crowning glory of the estate at this time. And you can see the edge, the side of it that has the crenellated addition. He has, in the pasture, allowed for the grazing of sheep, which was obviously a very English and sort of Gentile, or a thing with gentility, associated with gentility in English landowners. Here is another view of Erdenheim, R.N. Carson's country place at Chestnut Hill, showing the pasture and the mansion in the back with the lake and the gazebo and the bridge. And of course, again, looking just so very, very English in its appearance. Carson also, in his bid to create this country estate, did what most wealthy landowners of the time were doing, which was erecting very grand, spacious and ornamental greenhouses. And he chose the preeminent greenhouse manufacturer designer at the time, which was Lord and Burnham. If you look at records of estates that were constructed during the early 20th century, anyone who was anyone had a greenhouse that was designed by Lord and Burnham. Now, by 1916, the property passes out of the Carson estate to George D. Widener. His name is well known, probably doesn't need an introduction here, but for the purposes of sort of just trying to explain the history of his ownership of the property and his interest in thoroughbreds, I should say that he was the scion of a very, very wealthy Philadelphia family. He spent much of his time, his youth and his young adulthood, at Linwood Hall, which was the Elkins Park house of his grandfather, P.A.B. Widener. I'm guessing that most people on the call know that Linwood Hall has been saved, and it's in the hands of people who are currently working to restore it and raise a lot of money for its restoration, which is it's just a really happy moment. But during his ownership of Erdenheim, Widener bred and owned countless prize-winning racehorses. So this article is noting that in 1916, he purchased Erdenheim Farm, which was already one of the largest and most successful stock farms in the country. So he's already walking into a situation or property that's very well developed as an equestrian center. At the same time, the property also part of the property was also transferred from the Carson estate to the Carson School for Girls, which is located adjacent to the Erdenheim property. One more thing about Widener: at his death, he was eulogized by the New York Times, who noted that he was one of the most honored figures in thoroughbred racing. So this this lecture and the National Register nomination are really about the farm, but a whole nother book could be written about George Widener and his life, and his legacy, and his role in the history of thoroughbred racing. He's was entered into the Thoroughbred Hall of Fame. He has a huge name. So Widener, like Carson, set about to modernize the estate when he purchased it, by doing what? By starting with the demolition of some of the older resources that were on the estate, either erected by Kitson, some by Welch. So what he starts with, demolishing the original Erdenheim, which you see up on the left-hand corner. So anything that has an X through it was something that Widener chose to dispose of. And a writer at the time said that these buildings were sacrificed in the march of improvement. So he was making major improvements. The stable on the bottom left, the private stable, that was demolished, but the stable wall was retained. And also the bridge that Kitson put in, which was characterized as a massive stone bridge. He also he took that down and replaced it with this stone arch bridge that was designed by probably by Horace Trumbauer, but we'll get to that in a second. So in his march to improvement, one of the major things that he did was to commission Horace Trumbauer, a very famous Philadelphia architect who practiced in Philadelphia, but way outside of this region, and really became known as an architect of country houses. He also had a hand in designing the art museum and the free library. His name was all over large commissions of the period. So he was commissioned by Widener to more or less redesign the estate, and especially the buildings on the estate, to create more of a much more comprehensive kind of English country estate that also incorporated the equestrian operation. So what did he do? He one of his commissions was the bottom green check. That was a massive stable that he designed for Widener. And this all begins shortly after Widener comes into possession of the property, which is in 1916. So by 1917, he's starting to make these plans with Trumbauer and commissioning a lot of these important buildings. So the bottom check is the stable, and then the top check is worker housing for the stable hands and jockeys and so forth. This is a plan, courtesy of Erdenheim Farm. Dan Laurie or Peter Ernst provided this to me. This is Trumbauer's plan for the stable, which is still there. It has an indoor track, not a mile long, but still pretty substantial, and horse stalls. And it's just a remarkable remaining example of some of the extraordinary work that Horace Trumbauer did on that estate. And this is a picture of the estate. I wasn't actually able to capture the whole thing because it's so long in one frame, but you can get an idea of how large it is, how impressive it is. In the area of the mansion that was up on the hill, this was the mansion that Carson had re-envisioned as a kind of an English castle with the crenellated addition. Widener kind of reversed Carson's work. He filled in the pond, that's X through the pond, and he also demolished the greenhouses that Carson had constructed. One of the very large things that he did was he commissioned Olmsted Brothers, which was a firm as important as Trumborough was down here into architecture. The Olmsted Brothers was to American landscape design. It's the son and stepson of the Frederick Law Olmsted. Olmsted Brothers established what was the largest landscape design business in the country. And they did hundreds and hundreds, thousands of commissions across the country. A lot of them were country estates like Widener's, but they also did work in national parks. They did work for cities. And so their fingerprints are all over. Chestnut Hill has dozens of Olmsted landscapes. Lower Merion Township, where I'm from, Radnor Township. I think they're in excess of about 100 Olmsted landscapes between within the 3 counties of Philadelphia. Most don't survive fully intact, but this one does. And so it's really just, it's an extraordinary property in part because of the Olmsted landscape that is still here. And so here you see a plan from 1925, and they were working on the property for a long time, coming in and out, showing the creation of new lanes, new drives. We'll move on to the garden part of the complex, but they really had a hand in fully redesigning this part of the property. So this was right after work was completed. This photo and a couple of others come from the Olmsted Archive, which is in Brookline, Massachusetts, an extraordinary archive of the work that they've done and documented in both photographs and plans. So in the back here, you can see the stallion barn. Here is one of the existing farmhouses that were incorporated into Erdenheim that's still there. And here's a barn that most of it burned, which is not extant. Widener also commissioned Horace Trumbauer to redesign the farmhouse. So started as a farmhouse, moved into the Carson era where you had the redesigned house with the crenellated addition, and then with the addition of Horace Trumbauer to the team, you get a reimagined house, which is more classical revival in style with this double height portico, a big extension added to it. So it's not just the landscaping, it's the entire estate that is transformed. This is a view of the mansion, a present day view of the mansion from within the interior of it. And you can see that it's largely the same with some fairly minor changes, including, I mean, there's a natatorium, or there was, and smaller additions, but it remains very much on the exterior the way that Widener and Trumbauer envisioned it in the late teens and early 20s. Like most country estate owners of the time, Widener also wanted a formal garden and a very elaborate garden. So he commissioned Olmsted Brothers to design this for him. And at the time, the firm partnered with Horace Trumbauer to design the greenhouse in the background. So this is also a photograph from the Olmsted archive. And there are many, 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 happily, many photos showing the planning and the construction of the garden and the greenhouse and other resources associated with the Olmsted landscape plan. The greenhouse was used in multiple ads for Lord and Burnham. So it was a design of Horace Trumbauer, but it was created and erected by Lord and Burnham, which again was the preeminent manufacturer of greenhouses at the time. So here's an ad from the architect in 1927. And then here, this is actually an ad for fertilizer. So you can make your estate look like the Widener estate. And you see the garden in the background just by using Vigoro, the fertilizer. And that's from 1928. And it's less than a decade after the greenhouse was erected. This is a present day photograph of the greenhouse, slightly altered, but more or less looking pretty similar to what was envisioned by Trumbauer and Widener. And this is a piece of the landscape that was attached to the greenhouse. So there are walls and there are stairs. This is a rill that carries the water down to a pond that's enclosed by stone walls, and it's all very beautifully and formally decorated, and very, very similar to what again Widener and Trumbauer envisioned on their original plans. What else did he do? Well, he erected or had an indoor tennis court created for the property. This was Widener, also designed by Horace Trumbauer. So at the top, you see some renderings, sketches of what the greenhouse might have looked like. This design that you're seeing right here varies slightly from what was actually built, but it's fairly similar. And then the bottom, you can see the plan for this area, and this is along Thomas Road. So you have the big greenhouse, or pardon me, you have the big tennis court here, and then these ancillary buildings, a couple of cottages. There's a garage, but again, it's all envisioned by Trumbauer and Olmsted kind of working together to create this very comprehensive plan for this other part of the estate, which is separate from but integrated into the mansion area. This is a picture of the tennis building under construction. And this is a present day picture of the tennis building in the background with the cottages, the workers' cottages in the foreground. And these, again, are designed by Horace Trumbauer. And the palette of color that he used, the kinds of materials that he used, he integrated this palette, or he used it sort of comprehensively all across the estate to create kind of a whole and very put together look. So what you would characterize as kind of colonial revival in style. Like many wealthy landowners of the period, he also had Trumbauer design a playhouse for him, and playhouses were very popular. They were just what they sound like. They were playhouses, whether for adults or for children. This one was frame, so it differed somewhat from the other buildings on the estate, which were stucco. On the lower level of this, there's actually a pump house, and it's located very close to the Wissahickon, so used for both recreational purposes and very utilitarian purposes. But the pump house was very skillfully hidden below ground, so as not to really intrude on the overall appearance of this country estate. And this is a present day image of the playhouse, just in spectacular condition, has spectacular integrity, and really adds to the overall scheme of the design. And as a single resource, or as a single retained resource, speaks to the overall integrity of the estate. It's most of the buildings, if not all of the buildings that Trumbauer built, that Widener commissioned in the teens and early 20s, are still on the Erdenheim estate, which is very, very unusual. This is an aerial photograph taken about 1930 showing the estate mansion part of the mansion parcel of the estate. On the upper right is Thomas Road. In the back, you can see Andorra Nurseries, which was at the time, if not the largest, the largest nursery in the country. And Andorra supplied plants to gardeners all over the area. They also had a huge mail order business. Whatever you wanted, you could get from Andorra. So it's lucky that they were so close, because they also provided a lot of the plant material for the Widener estate. So at the top right, you can see the big tennis building with the white roof, and then the worker housing over here. Here's the garden with the greenhouse. And here, down here, we have the mansion. All of those drives that were laid out by Olmsted Brothers are visible in this image. Of course, are to a large extent, those drives still exist, and that the design as it is today. Up here is the White Marsh Valley Country Club with the clubhouse that was also a farmhouse, and then modified to create the clubhouse. Here's another one. This is probably one of my favorite images of the property. Again, this is 1930s-ish, which really high resolution image showing the mansion parcel. So you can see the Wissahickon in the distance, the bridge. You can see the mansion, you can see the gardens, and I think this is in winter. And so these features really, really do stand out. But what else did Widener do? Well, he also purchased an additional piece of property. It was an old farmstead, like most of the other resources on the property that predated the creation of the equestrian and country estate. This one is off Flowertown Road. This is where the Erdenheim Farm farm stand is, and this is where a lot of the pasturing of the animals occurs. So the X is a mark through the old barn, the barn that predated Widener's ownership. To the left, you can see that the farmhouse, which is still there. It's just this building right here, and it has kind of a wraparound porch, but it's a very typical farmstead for that period. And so Widener sets about transforming this property, just like he did with his other parcels, with Trumbauer designed buildings. And one of well, I guess it's probably the main piece, the landmark feature on this property, which is the sheep barn complex, Trumbauer designed. And if you head up to Erdenheim Farm, this is something that you can't miss. Here is an image of the property around the same time that he, just a few years after it was designed, with the sheep grazing. And of course, Widener branches out from the thoroughbred breeding and training to create a farmstead that also, or a country estate that also has a very large selection of livestock, including the sheep, cattle, and it became famous for many of those prize breeds that were raised and bred on the farm. And this is a present day photo, and I think that this is taken by Dan Lurie, and it just really shows the sheep barn complex in its glory with the blue sky and the sheep grazing. So moving kind of into more present day period, in 1971, George D. Widener died. And around this time, the property was transferred to his nephew, Fitz Eugene Dixon Jr. Dixon and his wife, Edith Dixon, carried on the Widener tradition, actually the very long tradition of thoroughbred racing or thoroughbred breeding and training on the property, as well as the farming activities. And this is just one of many articles that the Inquirer published over the years, showing activity at Erdenheim in the era leading up to the modern day. So I want to end this history of the farm. For the purposes of the National Register, we're kind of ending it in 1971 because that's the end of the George D. Widener's association with the property. But I do want to talk about the legacy of preservation that began with the Wideners and then moved to the Dixons and then on to other owners, including the White Marsh Foundation, which owns, I think, close to 200 acres of the total, the more than 470 acres that are under conservation easement. And then finally to the McCausland family, which owns the remaining acreage that's under easement and that operates the Erdenheim Farm farmstead and raises the distinctive livestock and has played just an enormous role in restoring pastureland, making Erdenheim really what it is today. So this image is from 1948. It's an aerial photograph showing the property when it's fully developed as Erdenheim Farm by this point, really by the late 1930s. Any new development has seeded on the farm, and you get the farm Erdenheim sort of as this fully developed property that's really focused on the equestrian activity and the farm. But if I use this photo and sort of overlay it with what you see at the present time, I think you can see how remarkable the efforts at preservation and conservation have been. So I'll just point out a couple of things in this image. So down here you have Andorra Nurseries, which in the late 40s is still very active. Over here you have White Marsh Valley Country Club. Up here you have the Philadelphia Cricket Club golf course, and then a little bit of development on the periphery. So it's at this point it's still a very very open and sort of underused or not very dense development. And if we move forward and just watch the progression and really slowly fading into the present day, you can see development that's really almost surrounded Erdenheim Farm. But the farm itself, as well as this property over here, which was the Carson School for Girls, really remains untouched. You have on the periphery more development down here. Up here you have the hill at White Marsh, which helped to enable, with the help of the Dixons, the preservation of this area, and then more development up here and up here, and here you have the quarry. But Erdenheim Farm looks very, very similar now from the air as well as from the street level, as it did in 1917 when George Widener developed it as it is. And that concludes my lecture, and I thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. And I know that Dan Leroy is always also on the call and would welcome questions as well. So thank you.
Well, we don't have any questions posted in the chat, Kathleen and Dan, but I would love to invite Dan to talk a little bit more about the farm and the easements on the farm and how how it works to have conservation easements on a working farm.
Thanks, Lori, and thanks, Kathleen. That was really interesting. I particularly loved that last little piece there with the image transitioning from history to modern day. So well done. Lori, that's a good question. To be honest, though, it doesn't really affect the operations of the farm much at all, in terms of the easements, because largely the operations of the farm are what they have been for a very long time, preceding the establishment of the conservation easements.
And another question for you, Dan. How many sheep and cows do you have there?
Okay, sure. Yeah, we have today there's about 90 cattle on the property, and sheep similar. I think it's about 96 sheep.
And now a question for Kathleen. Kathleen, that was a really wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. What was in your investigation of this? Because I think we are all familiar with Erdenheim Farm and how special it is, but what would you say was the most surprising thing you discovered about the history or the buildings there?
Well, thanks for that question, Lori. For me, it was how intact the farm is, and not just the buildings, but the entire property, the landscape. It's just so extraordinary. And going back and doing the history of it, you know, seeing how similar it looks now, to the way it looked during Widener's ownership of it. It's a little bit harder to gauge what it looked like before that, because there's not as much documentation that exists. So just the integrity of the landscape and the buildings and how well they've been maintained, the condition of the buildings overall is just extraordinary. The fact that there's an Olmsted landscape that still exists. Last year I did a lecture for the Lower Merion Conservancy on Olmsted landscapes, and I know the Conservancy also did a program on Olmsted landscapes in Chestnut Hill, but you know, we were only able to find pieces of Olmsted landscapes that exist. There may be a gate here and a wall there, and some landscape features that stand out more than others. Most just aren't visible because they're hidden behind properties. So there's lots of it out there, but it doesn't make itself apparent or as present as this does. So walking into the mansion parcel and seeing an incredibly intact Olmsted landscape and also with the drives circulating through the property, and then looking at the images and plans from the Olmsted archive and comparing them and seeing, you know, oh, there's some loss of plant material maybe, but that's going to happen because plants don't live forever, but they've been replaced with other things. So that really was extraordinary. And then also the continued operation of the farm as it operated historically. That was also a really kind of, that made this project just really, really enjoyable.
I can only imagine how enjoyable this project was, and diving into all of this research. One of the questions that has been asked is about the origin of the name Erdenheim. And we were talking about that before the program. That's apparently the big mystery that you're still trying to figure out.
Yeah, the name is somewhat elusive. There is I think kind of an oral history or secondary source history that takes the name back to an earlier period before it became an equestrian farm. The research that I've done on the property suggests that the name Erdenheim Farm might not have been attached to the property until the late 19th century. In articles and documentation from the period, it's referred to as Leamington Stud Farm, which would have been a reference to one of the first thoroughbreds that lived there, Leamington. it was Chestnut Hill Stud Farm, which was a little confusing because there was another Chestnut Hill Stud Farm, but the name Erdenheim does not seem to have stuck until I think sometime in the 1880s.
Harry is asking a bunch of really good questions. Is the farm protected by a trust, and will it continue to be preserved? Now, we had talked about the easements on the land, and which will ensure the preservation of the land. And her question, is the farm protected by a trust? Can you, Dan, can you answer that, or?
Yeah, I don't know if I would phrase it quite that way in terms of being protected by a trust, but as we've said, the conservation easements are in place that certainly protect the development of the farm, really prohibiting anything but the most limited development. And there's certainly no plans to, do anything except continue preserving and protecting the farm.
Are there ever tours? Is another question.
Yes, there are. We launched a program. The Erdenheim Farm Foundation launched a program about 2 years ago, a combination volunteer docent program where we have a limited volunteer program, training participants to teach others about the farm and lead tours. And then we offer limited tours by reservation only to the public. And those are going on currently, and will continue well into the month of June. You can find out more information about that if you email tours@erdenheimfarm.com.
Tours@erdenheimfarm.com. Perhaps we can put that in the chat. Is there a plan in place for establishing riparian buffers along the creek?
It's something that we've been doing. The McCallsons have been doing pretty much ever since they purchased the farm 15 years ago, planting literally hundreds and hundreds of trees. So there are already areas along the Wissahickon that have far more canopy and coverage than they ever used to. And it's a process I have no doubt will continue.
Carolyn Adams would like to know whether the wildflower meadow at Thomas and Flowertown intersection bloom again this year. We've talked about that wildflower meadow. Really, that was quite a dramatic transformation.
Yeah, that's been many years in the works, and to me it is really representative of yet another astonishing gift from the McCallsons to the community. And yes, it's doing really well. There's at least 20 species of wildflowers in there that have come back up this year, and in a number of weeks to months, I'm sure it will be spectacular once again.
Well, I know I agree with what was written, that the meadow's been a joy to drive by when it's in bloom and just to look at, and it's an inspiration. Converting lawns to meadow is a very important conservation approach.
Laura, may I also just mention the Dixon Meadow Preserve, which is on the corner of Thomas and Flowertown, and that is also part of Erdenheim Farm. It's been preserved, and that's publicly accessible and owned by the neighboring White Marsh Foundation. And all of that land, of course, is within the historic boundaries of Erdenheim Farm.
Remarkable. Who owned the farm between 1971 and the McCallsons? Do you know, Kathleen?
The Dixon family. Most of it was owned by the Dixon family.
Well, is there anything else that you, Kathleen or Dan, would like to add or share with our guests this evening?
Well, I just say, having worked on the National Register nomination, that this is just an extraordinary property, something that's incredibly unusual in this area, that within this very, very densely developed area, within such close proximity to Philadelphia that we have something like this. And really it is due to a very long history of stewardship of this property and some very, very committed individuals who made this happen. And if you haven't been out to see Erdenheim, it's well worth a visit.
Truly. So I'm just seeing in the chat a message from Suzanne Fitzpatrick that she went to school in the 1960s with Widener's granddaughter, and their end of year class party was held at the estate. All the 10 and 11-year-olds in her class swam in the pool with the steps leading to the fountain in the pool. It still looks the same. And she was delighted that it's so beautiful and so well preserved. So I think that's a lovely point to end this evening's lecture and discussion on. This has been absolutely fascinating and really just it's hard to believe that this exists still, and that and really remarkable gift, as you were saying, to the community, the choices that the family has made to not just preserve the farm and the land and the architecture, but to be so creative and engaging the neighbors in the neighborhood and interacting with the school, and just really a spectacular, wonderful gift. So thank you both very much for sharing what you know about Erdenheim Farm and helping to make it an even more exciting place to be visiting and thinking about. And thanks to everyone who attended this evening's lecture. I hope that we see you again soon, and specifically at the Conservancy, Chestnut Hill Conservancy's June 8th gala. Looking forward to seeing everyone there, and thank you again very much, Kathleen and Dan, and to the McCausland family and Peter Ernst and JB Ward. Have a lovely night, and enjoy the wildflowers.
Thank you, Kathleen.